Welcome to Soft Hour Library. Tonight's story begins now. Close your eyes and rest.
Chapter 4. The psychoanalytic work has taught us that precisely these frustrations of sexual life are not tolerated by the so-called neurotics. They create substitute satisfactions for themselves in their symptoms, which however either in themselves create suffering or become sources of suffering by causing them difficulties with their environment and society. The latter is easily understandable. The former presents us with a new riddle. But culture demands still other sacrifices besides that of sexual satisfaction. We have conceived the difficulty of cultural development as a general difficulty of development by tracing it back to the inertia of the libido, to its disinclination to abandon an old position for a new one. We are saying approximately the same thing when we derive the antithesis between culture and sexuality from the fact that sexual love is a relationship between two persons in which a third can only be superfluous or disturbing, whereas culture rests on relationships among a larger number of people. At the height of a love relationship, there remains no interest in the surrounding world. The loving couple suffices to itself, does not even need the common child to be happy. In no other case does Eros so clearly reveal the core of his being, the intention to make one out of several. But when he has achieved this, as has become proverbial, in the mutual love of two people, he does not want to go beyond it. We can so far imagine very well that a cultural community might consist of such double individuals who, libidinally satisfied in themselves, are connected to one another through the bond of work and common interest. In this case, culture would not need to withdraw energy from sexuality. But this desirable state does not and has never existed. Reality shows us that culture is not content with the bonds so far allowed it, that it also wants to bind the members of the community to one another libidinally, that it makes use of every means for this, favors every path to establish strong identifications among them, deploys aim-inhibited libido to the greatest extent to strengthen the community bonds through friendship relationships. For the fulfillment of this intention, the restriction of sexual life becomes unavoidable. But we lack insight into the necessity that pushes culture onto this path and founds its opposition to sexuality. It must be a matter of a disturbing factor that we have not yet discovered. One of the so-called ideal demands of cultural society may show us the trail here. It reads, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." It is world famous, certainly older than Christianity, which displays it as its proudest claim, but surely not very old. In historical times it was still foreign to people. Let us adopt a naive attitude toward it, as if we were hearing it for the first time. Then we cannot suppress a feeling of surprise and strangeness. Why should we do that? What will it help us, above all? How can we achieve it? How does it become possible for us? My love is something valuable to me, which I may not dispose of without accountability. It imposes duties on me, which I must be prepared to fulfill with sacrifices. If I love someone, he must deserve it in some way. I disregard the use he can bring me, as well as his possible significance as a sexual object for me. These two types of relationship do not come into consideration for the precept of neighbor love. He deserves it if he is so similar to me in important respects that I can love myself in him. He deserves it if he is so much more perfect than I that I can love my ideal of my own person in him. I must love him if he is my friend's son. For the pain of my friend if something happened to him would also be my pain. I would have to share it. But if he is strange to me and cannot attract me through any value of his own, no significance already acquired for my emotional life, it will be hard for me to love him. I even do wrong thereby. For my love is valued by all mine as a preferment. It is an injustice to them if I put the stranger on a level with them. But if I am to love him with that universal love, just because he too is a being of this earth, like the insect, the earthworm, the grass snake, then I fear only a small amount of love will fall to him, impossible as much as by the judgment of reason I am entitled to retain for myself. What is the point of such a solemnly pronounced prescription if its fulfillment cannot recommend itself as reasonable? When I look more closely, I find even more difficulties. This stranger is not only generally not worthy of love, I must honestly confess he has more claim to my hostility, even to my hatred. He seems not to have the slightest love for me, shows me not the slightest consideration. If it brings him a benefit, he has no hesitation in harming me, does not even ask himself whether the amount of his benefit corresponds to the magnitude of the harm he inflicts on me. Indeed, he does not even need to gain a benefit if he can merely satisfy some pleasure with it. He makes nothing of mocking me, insulting me, slandering me, showing his power over me. And the more secure he feels, the more helpless I am, the more certainly I can expect this behavior from him toward me. If he behaves differently, if as a stranger he shows me consideration and forbearance, I am ready in any case to reciprocate in similar manner, even without that precept. Indeed, if that grandiose commandment read, "Love your neighbor as your neighbor loves you," then I would not object. There is a second commandment that seems even more incomprehensible to me and releases an even more vehement resistance in me. It runs, "Love your enemies." When I think it over properly, I am wrong to reject it as an even stronger imposition. It is fundamentally the same thing. I believe I now hear a dignified voice admonishing me, precisely because your neighbor is not worthy of love, and is rather your enemy. You should love him as yourself. I then understand that this is a similar case to the credo quia absurdum. Now it is very probable that the neighbor, when he is asked to love me as himself, will answer exactly as I do and reject me with the same justifications. I hope, not with the same objective right, but he will think the same thing. Even so, there are differences in people's behavior, which ethics classifies as good and evil, disregarding their conditionedness. As long as these undeniable differences are not abolished, adherence to the high ethical demands signifies a damage to the intentions of culture by directly setting up premiums for being evil. One cannot here dismiss the memory of an incident that occurred in the French chamber when the death penalty was being debated. A speaker had passionately advocated its abolition and was reaping stormy applause, until a voice from the hall interjected the words, Que messieurs les assassins commencent. The readily denied piece of reality behind all this is that man is not a gentle being in need of love, who at most can defend himself if attacked, but that he may count a powerful share of aggressiveness among his instinctual endowments. As a result, his neighbor is to him not only a potential helper and sexual object, but also a temptation to satisfy his aggressiveness on him, to exploit his labor without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture and kill him. Homo homini lupus, who has the courage to dispute this proposition after all the experiences of life and history? As a rule, this cruel aggression waits for a provocation or puts itself in the service of another purpose whose goal could also have been reached with milder means. Under favorable circumstances, when the mental counterforces that usually inhibit it are absent, it also manifests itself spontaneously, reveals man as a savage beast to whom consideration for his own kind is foreign. Whoever recalls the atrocities of the great migrations, of the invasions by the Huns, by the so-called Mongols under Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, of the conquest of Jerusalem by the pious Crusaders, even still the horrors of the last World War, will have to bow humbly before the reality of this view. The existence of this inclination to aggression, which we can detect in ourselves and rightly presume in others, is the factor that disturbs our relationship to our neighbor and compels culture to its expenditure. Because of this primary mutual hostility of human beings, civilized society is perpetually threatened with disintegration. The interest of the work community would not hold it together. Instinctual passions are stronger than reasonable interests. Culture must do everything to set limits to man's aggressive drives and to hold down their manifestations by psychical reaction formations. Hence, therefore, the employment of methods to incite people to identifications and aim-inhibited love relationships. Hence the restriction on sexual life. And hence also the ideal commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself, which is really justified by the fact that nothing else runs so strongly counter to original human nature. Despite all its efforts, this endeavor of culture has so far not achieved very much. It hopes to prevent the crudest excesses of brutal violence by itself, assuming the right to use violence against criminals. But the law cannot lay hands on the more cautious and refined manifestations of human aggression. Each of us comes to abandon as illusions the expectations he linked in his youth to his fellow men, and may experience how much life is made difficult and painful for him by their ill will. At the same time, it would be unjust to reproach culture for wanting to exclude strife and competition from human activities. These are certainly indispensable, but opposition is not necessarily enmity. It is only misused to become an occasion for it. The communists believe they have found the way to deliverance from evil. Man is unequivocally good, well disposed toward his neighbor. But the institution of private property has corrupted his nature. Possession of private goods gives one the power and thereby the temptation to mistreat one's neighbor. The one excluded from possession must rebel in hostility against the oppressor. If private property is abolished, all goods made common, and all people allowed to share in their enjoyment, Ill will and hostility among people will vanish. Since all needs are satisfied, no one will have reason to see in the other his enemy. All will willingly undergo the necessary work. I have nothing to do with the economic criticism of the communist system. I cannot investigate whether the abolition of private property is expedient and advantageous. But I am able to recognize its psychological presupposition as an untenable illusion. With the abolition of private property, one withdraws from human aggressiveness, one of its instruments. Certainly a strong one, and certainly not the strongest. Nothing has thereby been changed in the differences of power and influence that aggression misuses for its purposes, nor in its nature. Aggression was not created by property. It reigned almost unrestricted in primeval times when property was still very scanty. Shows itself already in the nursery scarcely, after property has given up its original anal form. Forms the sediment of all tender and loving relationships among people, with the possible sole exception of a mother to her male child. If one abolishes personal right to material goods, there still remains the prerogative from sexual relationships, which must become the source of the strongest envy and the most violent hostility among people otherwise equal in status. If one also abolishes this by complete liberation of sexual life, thus eliminating the family, the germ cell of culture, then one cannot, it is true, foresee what new paths cultural development may take. But one may expect that the indestructible feature of human nature will follow it there too. Men obviously do not find it easy to do without satisfaction of their inclination to aggression. They do not feel comfortable without it. The advantage of a smaller cultural circle, that it allows the drive and outlet in hostility toward outsiders, is not to be despised. It is always possible to bind a larger mass of people together in love, if only others remain over for the manifestation of aggressiveness. I once concerned myself with the phenomenon that precisely neighboring and otherwise close communities feud and mock one another, such as Spaniards and Portuguese, North and South Germans, English and Scots, etc. I gave it the name narcissism of small differences, which does not contribute much to the explanation. One now recognizes in it a convenient and relatively harmless satisfaction of the inclination to aggression, through which cohesion among the members of the community is made easier. The Jewish people, scattered everywhere, have in this manner acquired recognizable merit for the cultures of their host peoples. Unfortunately, all the massacres of Jews in the Middle Ages did not suffice to make that era more peaceful and secure for their Christian contemporaries. After the Apostle Paul had made universal love of mankind the foundation of his Christian community, extreme intolerance of Christianity toward those remaining outside had become an inevitable consequence to the Romans, who had not founded their state community on love. Religious intolerance had been foreign, although religion with them was a matter of state, and the state was permeated by religion. Nor was it an incomprehensible accident that the dream of Germanic world domination called upon anti-Semitism for its completion. And one recognizes it as comprehensible that the attempt to build up a new communist culture in Russia finds its psychological support in the persecution of the bourgeois. One only asks oneself with concern what the Soviets will do after they have exterminated their bourgeois. If culture imposes such great sacrifices not only on man's sexuality, but also on his aggressiveness, we understand better why it is difficult for him to feel happy in it. Primeval man was actually better off in this, for he knew no instinctual restrictions. As compensation, his security of enjoying such happiness for long was a very slight one. Civilized man has exchanged a portion of his possibilities of happiness for a portion of security. But we must not forget that in the primal family, only the head enjoyed such instinctual freedom. The rest lived in slavish suppression. The contrast between a minority enjoying the advantages of culture and a majority deprived of those advantages was therefore in that primeval time of culture taken to the extreme. Regarding the primitive peoples living today, more careful investigation has taught us that their instinctual life is by no means to be envied for its freedom. It is subject to restrictions of another kind, but perhaps of greater severity than that of modern civilized man. When we rightly object to our present cultural state, how inadequately it fulfills our demands for a happiness-making life order, how much suffering it permits that is probably avoidable, when we strive with unsparing criticism to uncover the roots of its imperfection, we are certainly exercising our good right and showing ourselves not as enemies of culture. We may expect gradually to push through such modifications of our culture as will better satisfy our needs and escape that criticism. But perhaps we may also familiarize ourselves with the idea that there are difficulties inherent in the nature of culture that will not yield to any attempt at reform. Besides the task of instinctual restriction, for which we are prepared, the danger of a state forces itself upon us that one might call the psychological misery of the mass. This danger threatens most readily where the social bond is mainly established through identifications of the participants with one another. While leader personalities do not attain the significance that should fall to them in mass formation, the present cultural state of America would give a good opportunity to study this feared cultural harm. But I avoid the temptation to enter into a critique of American culture. I do not want to give the impression that I myself want to use American methods. Chapter 5. I have never with any work had the feeling as strongly as this time that I am presenting generally known things, expending paper and ink, consequently typesetters' work and printers' ink, to relate things that are actually self-evident. For this reason, I gladly take it up when the appearance arises that the recognition of a particular independent aggressive drive signifies a modification of psychoanalytic drive theory. It will be shown that this is not so, that it is merely a matter of grasping more sharply a turn that was long ago made and pursuing it into its consequences. Of all the slowly developed pieces of analytic theory, drive theory has groped forward most laboriously. And yet it was so indispensable to the whole that something had to be put in its place. In complete perplexity at the beginning, the saying of the poet-philosopher Schiller gave me the first foothold, that hunger and love hold the world's mechanism together. Hunger could serve as representative of those drives that want to preserve the individual being. Love strives for objects, its main function, favored by nature in every way, is the preservation of the species. Thus at first ego drives and object drives confronted each other. For the energy of the latter, and exclusively for them, I introduced the term libido. Thus the opposition ran between the ego drives and the libidinous drives of love in the broadest sense. One of these object drives, the sadistic, did indeed stand out through the fact that its aim was so very far from loving. Also, in many respects, it obviously joined the ego drives, could not conceal its close kinship with drives of mastery without libidinous purpose. But one got over this inconsistency. Sadism belonged after all obviously to sexual life, in which the cruel game could replace the tender one. Neurosis appeared as the outcome of a struggle between the interest of self-preservation and the demands of the libido. A struggle in which the ego had won, but at the price of severe sufferings and renunciations. Every analyst will admit that even today this does not sound like a long-overcome error. Yet a modification became indispensable when our research advanced from the repressed to the repressing, from the object drives to the ego. Decisive here was the introduction of the concept of narcissism. That is, the insight that the ego itself is cathected with libido, is indeed its original home, and remains to some extent always its headquarters. This narcissistic libido turns toward objects, thus becomes object libido, and can transform itself back into narcissistic libido. The concept of narcissism made it possible to grasp traumatic neuroses analytically, as well as many affections close to the psychoses and these themselves. The interpretation of transference neuroses as attempts of the ego to ward off sexuality did not need to be abandoned. But the concept of libido got into danger. Since the ego drives too were libidinous, it seemed for a while unavoidable to let libido coincide with instinctual energy in general. As C. G. Jung had already wanted earlier. Yet something remained like a still unfoundable certainty that the drives cannot all be of the same kind. The next step I took in beyond the pleasure principle, 1920, when the compulsion to repeat and the conservative character of instinctual life first struck me. Starting from speculations about the beginning of life and from biological parallels, I drew the conclusion that besides the drive to preserve living substance and to combine it into ever larger units, there must be another, antithetical to it, which seeks to dissolve these units and lead them back to the primordial, inorganic state. Thus, besides eros, a death drive, from the cooperation and opposition of these two, the phenomena of life could be explained. Now it was not easy to demonstrate the activity of this assumed death drive. The manifestations of eros were conspicuous and noisy enough. One could assume that the death drive works silently within the living being at its dissolution. But that was naturally no proof. The idea went further that a portion of the drive turns against the external world, and then comes to light as a drive to aggression and destruction. The drive would thus itself be pressed into the service of eros, in that the living being destroyed something else, animate or inanimate, instead of its own self. Conversely, any restriction of this aggression directed outward would be bound to increase the self-destruction that is always going on. At the same time, one could guess from this example that the two kinds of drives seldom, perhaps never, appear isolated from one another. but alloy themselves with one another in varying, very changing mixing proportions, and thereby become unrecognizable to our judgment. In sadism, long known as a component drive of sexuality, one would have before oneself such a particularly strong alloy of the love-striving with the destruction drive. As in its counterpart, masochism, a connection of inwardly directed destruction with sexuality, through which the otherwise imperceptible striving becomes conspicuous and tangible. The assumption of the death or destruction drive has found resistance even in analytic circles. I know that there is widespread inclination to ascribe rather everything dangerous and hostile found in love to an original bipolarity of its own nature. I had at first advocated the views developed here only tentatively, but in the course of time they have gained such power over me that I can no longer think any other way. I think they are theoretically incomparably more useful than all possible others. They provide that simplification without neglect or forcing of the facts for which we strive in scientific work. I recognize that in sadism and masochism we have always seen before us the strongly alloy with eroticism manifestations of the destruction drive, directed outward and inward. But I no longer understand that we could overlook the ubiquity of non-erotic aggression and destruction, and fail to give it its due place in the interpretation of life. The inward-turned lust for destruction mostly escapes perception. Of course, when it is not erotically colored. I remember my own defense when the idea of the destruction drive first appeared in psychoanalytic literature, and how long it took until I became receptive to it. That others showed and still show the same rejection surprises me less. For the little children do not like to hear it, when the innate inclination of humans to evil, to aggression, destruction, and thereby also to cruelty is mentioned. God has after all created them in the image of his own perfection. One does not want to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile despite the assurances of Christian science, undeniable existence of evil with his omnipotence or his all-goodness. The devil would be the best excuse for God. He would thereby take on the same economically relieving role as the Jew does in the world of the Aryan ideal. But even so, one can demand accountability from God just as much for the existence of the devil as for the existence of the evil he embodies. In view of these difficulties, it is advisable for everyone to make a deep bow before the deeply moral nature of mankind at an appropriate place. It helps one to general popularity, and much is forgiven one for it. The name libido can again be used for the manifestations of force of eros, in order to separate them from the energy of the death drive. It must be admitted that we grasp the latter much more difficultly, so to speak only as a residue behind eros, and that it eludes us where it does not betray itself through the alloy with eros. In sadism, where it bends the erotic goal in its sense, yet fully satisfying the sexual striving at the same time, we succeed in obtaining the clearest insight into its nature and its relation to eros. But even where it appears without sexual purpose, even in the blindest destructive rage, one cannot fail to recognize that its satisfaction is linked with an extraordinarily high narcissistic enjoyment, showing the ego the fulfillment of its old wishes for omnipotence, moderated and tamed, aim inhibited, so to speak. The destruction drive, directed at objects, must procure the ego the satisfaction of its vital needs and mastery over nature. Since its assumption rests essentially on theoretical grounds, one must admit that it is also not fully secured against theoretical objections. But that is how it appears to us now with the present state of our insights. Future research and reflection will certainly bring decisive clarity. For everything further, then, I place myself at the standpoint that the inclination to aggression is an original, independent, instinctual disposition of man. And I return to the point that culture finds its strongest obstacle in it. At some point in the course of this investigation, the insight forced itself upon us that culture is a special process that runs over mankind. And we still stand under the spell of this idea. We add that it is a process in the service of Eros, which wants to combine isolated human individuals, then families, then tribes, peoples, nations into one great unity, that of humanity. Why this must happen we do not know. It is simply the work of Eros. These masses of people are to be libidinally bound to one another, necessity alone. The advantages of the work community will not hold them together. But this program of culture is opposed by man's natural aggressive drive, the hostility of each against all and all against each. This aggressive drive is the derivative and main representative of the death drive, which we have found alongside Eros, sharing world domination with him. And now, I think, the meaning of cultural development is no longer obscure to us. It must show us the struggle between Eros and death, between the life drive and the destruction drive, as it is accomplished in the human species. This struggle is the essential content of life in general, and therefore cultural development is to be briefly designated as the life struggle of the human species. And this strife of giants our nursemaids want to appease with their hushaby from heaven. Chapter 6. Why do our relatives, the animals, show no such cultural struggle? Oh, we do not know. Very probably some among them, the bees, ants, termites, have struggled for thousands of centuries until they found those state institutions, that distribution of functions, those restrictions of individuals that we admire in them today. It is characteristic of our present state that our feelings tell us we would not consider ourselves happy in any of these animal states, and in any of the roles allotted there to the individual. With other animal species, it may have come to a temporary balance between the influences of the environment and the mutually combating drives within them, thus to a standstill of development. In primeval man, a new advance of the libido may have kindled a renewed resistance of the destruction drive. There is much to ask here, for which there is no answer yet. Another question lies closer to us. What means does culture employ to inhibit the aggressiveness opposing it? To render it harmless? Perhaps to eliminate it? Some such methods we have already learned, but apparently not yet the most important one. We can study it in the developmental history of the individual. What happens with him to render his lust for aggression harmless? Something very remarkable, which we would not have guessed and which is yet so obvious. The aggression is introjected, internalized, actually sent back where it came from. That is, directed against one's own ego. There it is taken over by a portion of the ego that sets itself against the rest as superego. And now as conscience, exercises the same harsh aggressiveness against the ego that the ego would have liked to satisfy on other foreign individuals. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego subjected to it we call a sense of guilt. It manifests itself as a need for punishment. Culture, therefore, masters the dangerous aggressive lust of the individual by weakening, disarming him, and having him watched over by an agency within him, like a garrison in a conquered city. As to the origin of the sense of guilt, the analyst thinks differently from other psychologists, nor will it be easy for him to give an account of it. First, if one asks how one comes to have a sense of guilt, one receives an answer one cannot dispute. One feels guilty, pious people say, sinful, when one has done something one recognizes as bad. Then one notices how little this answer gives. Perhaps after some hesitation one will add that even someone who has not done this bad thing, but has merely recognized the intention to do it in himself, can consider himself guilty. And then one will raise the question, why here the intention is equated with the execution. Both cases, however, presuppose that one has already recognized the bad as reprehensible, as to be excluded from execution. How does one come to this decision? One may reject an original, so to speak natural, faculty of discrimination between good and bad. Bad is often not at all what is harmful or dangerous to the ego. On the contrary, also something that is desirable to it, gives it pleasure. Thus foreign influence shows itself here. This determines what should be called good and bad. Since one's own sensation would not have led people onto the same path, they must have a motive to submit to this foreign influence. It is easy to discover in their helplessness and dependence on others. Can best be designated as fear of loss of love. If one loses the love of the other on whom one is dependent, one also forfeits protection against various dangers, exposes oneself above all to the danger that this overpowering one will demonstrate his superiority in the form of punishment. The bad is therefore initially that for which one is threatened with loss of love. For fear of this loss one must avoid it. That is why it also makes little difference whether one has already done the bad or only wants to do it. In both cases the danger only arises when the authority discovers it. And the authority would behave similarly in both cases. This state is called bad conscience. But actually, it does not yet deserve this name. For at this stage, the sense of guilt is obviously only anxiety about loss of love. Social anxiety. In the small child, it can never be anything else. But also in many adults, nothing more changes about it than that the place of the father or both parents is taken by the larger human community. Therefore they regularly allow themselves to do the bad that promises them pleasure, if only they are sure that the authority will learn nothing of it or cannot do anything to them. And their anxiety is solely directed at discovery. With this state contemporary society in general has to reckon. A great change occurs only when the authority is internalized through the erection of a superego. The conscience phenomena are thereby raised to a new level. Actually, one should speak of conscience and sense of guilt only now. Now the fear of being discovered, and complete the difference between doing bad and wanting to do bad fall away. For nothing can be concealed from the superego, not even thoughts. The real seriousness of the situation has admittedly passed. For the new authority, the superego, has in our belief no motive to mistreat the ego with which it is intimately joined. But the influence of Genesis, which lets the past and overcome live on, expresses itself in that fundamentally it remains as it was at the beginning. The superego torments the sinful ego with the same anxiety feelings and lies in wait for opportunities to have it punished by the external world. At this second stage of development, conscience shows a peculiarity that was foreign to the first and is no longer easy to explain. It behaves namely all the more sternly and mistrustfully the more virtuous the person is. So that in the end, precisely those who have taken holiness the furthest accuse themselves of the worst sinfulness. Virtue thereby forfeits a piece of the reward promised to it. The docile and abstinent ego does not enjoy the trust of its mentor. Strives, it seems, in vain to earn it. Now one will be ready to object. These are artificially contrived difficulties. The stricter and more vigilant conscience is precisely the distinguishing mark of the moral person. And if the saints declare themselves sinners, they are not wrong to do so in view of the temptations to drive satisfaction to which they are exposed in a specially high degree, since temptations are known to merely increase with constant frustration, whereas they at least temporarily subside with occasional satisfaction. Another fact of the field of ethics, so rich in problems, is that misfortune, thus external frustration, so greatly increases the power of conscience in the superego. As long as things go well for a person, his conscience is also mild and lets the ego get away with much. When misfortune has struck him, he holds inward examination, recognizes his sinfulness, heightens his conscience demands, imposes abstinences on himself, and punishes himself with penances. Entire peoples have behaved and still behave in the same way. But this is easily explained from the original infantile stage of conscience, which is therefore not abandoned after the introjection into the superego, but persists alongside and behind it. Fate is regarded as a substitute for the parental agency. If one has misfortune, it means that one is no longer loved by this highest power, and threatened by this loss of love. One bows once more before the parental representation in the superego that one wanted to neglect in good fortune. This becomes especially clear when one recognizes in fate, in the strictly religious sense, only the expression of the divine will. The people of Israel had considered themselves God's favorite child, when the Great Father let misfortune after misfortune rain down on this, his people. They did not become doubtful of this relationship or question his power and justice, but rather produced the prophets who held up to them their sinfulness and created out of their sense of guilt the overstern prescriptions of their priestly religion. It is remarkable how differently the primitive person behaves if he has had misfortune. He does not give himself the blame but the fetish, which has obviously not done its duty, and he beats it instead of punishing himself. We therefore know two origins of the sense of guilt, one from fear of the authority and the later one from fear of the superego. The first compels one to renounce drive satisfactions, The second presses. Since one cannot conceal the persistence of forbidden wishes from the superego. In addition to punishment, we have also heard how the severity of the superego, thus the demands of conscience, is to be understood. It simply continues the severity of the external authority, which it has relieved and partly replaced. We now see in what relationship drive renunciation stands to the sense of guilt. Originally, drive renunciation is the consequence of fear of the external authority. One renounces satisfactions so as not to lose its love. Having accomplished this renunciation, one is, so to speak, quits with it. No sense of guilt should remain. Different is the case of fear of the superego. Here, drive renunciation does not suffice, for the wish persists and cannot be concealed from the superego. Despite the accomplished renunciation, a sense of guilt will therefore come about. And this is a great economic disadvantage of the superego institution. As one can say, of conscience formation, drive renunciation now no longer has a fully liberating effect. Virtuous abstinence is no longer rewarded by the assurance of love, for a threatening external misfortune, loss of love and punishment from the external authority. One has exchanged a lasting internal misfortune, the tension of the sense of guilt. These relationships are so complicated, and at the same time so important that I would like to attack them from yet another side. Despite the dangers of repetition, the temporal sequence would therefore be: first, drive renunciation as a result of fear of aggression from the external authority, for that is what the fear of loss of love amounts to. Love protects against this punishing aggression, then erection of the internal authority. Drive renunciation as a result of fear of it. Conscience anxiety. In the second case, equation of bad deed and bad intention. Hence sense of guilt. Need for punishment. The aggression of conscience conserves the aggression of the authority. So far it has probably become clear. But where does room remain for the conscience-strengthening influence of misfortune, of externally imposed renunciation? For the extraordinary severity of conscience in the best and most docile, we have already explained both peculiarities of conscience, but probably left behind the impression that these explanations do not reach to the bottom, leave a residue unexplained. And here finally, an idea intervenes that belongs entirely to psychoanalysis and is foreign to ordinary people's thinking. It is of such a kind that it lets us understand why the subject had to appear so confused and impenetrable to us. It says namely that in the beginning, to be sure, conscience more correctly, the anxiety which later becomes conscience, is the cause of drive renunciation. But later the relationship reverses. Every drive renunciation now becomes a dynamic source of conscience. Every new renunciation increases its severity and intolerance. And if we could only bring it into better agreement with the known history of the origin of conscience, we would be tempted to commit ourselves to the paradoxical proposition: conscience is the consequence of drive renunciation, or drive renunciation imposed on us from without creates conscience, which then demands further drive renunciation. The contradiction of this proposition with the given genesis of conscience is actually not so great, and we see a way to diminish it further. For the sake of easier presentation, Let us take the example of the aggressive drive and assume that in these relationships it is always a matter of renunciation of aggression. This should naturally be only a provisional assumption. The effect of drive renunciation on conscience then proceeds in such a way that every piece of aggression whose satisfaction we omit is taken over by the superego and increases its aggression against the ego. This does not fit well with the fact that the original aggression of conscience is the continued severity of the external authority, thus has nothing to do with renunciation. But we bring this inconsistency to disappearance if we assume a different derivation for this first aggression outfitting of the superego against the authority that prevents the child from the first, but also most significant satisfactions. A considerable amount of aggression must have developed in the child, regardless of what kind the required drive renunciations were. By necessity, the child had to renounce the satisfaction of this vengeful aggression. It helps itself out of this difficult economic situation by means of familiar mechanisms, by taking this unassailable authority into itself through identification, which now becomes the superego and enters into possession of all the aggression that one would have liked to exercise against it as a child. The child's ego must content itself with the sad role of the authority thus humiliated, the father. It is a reversal of the situation. As so often, if I were the father and you the child, I would treat you badly. The relationship between superego and ego is the wish-distorted return of real relationships between the still undivided ego and an external object. That too is typical. The essential difference, however, is that the original severity of the superego is not, or not so much, the one that has been experienced from it or that one imputes to it, but represents one's own aggression against it. If this is true, one may really assert that conscience arose in the beginning through suppression of an aggression, and strengthened in the further course through new such suppressions. Which of the two conceptions is now right, the earlier one, which seemed to us genetically so unassailable, or the newer one, which rounds out the theory in such a welcome way, obviously, also according to the testimony of direct observation? Both are justified, they do not contradict one another, even meet at one point. For the vengeful aggression of the child will be co-determined by the measure of punishing aggression it expects from the father. Experience teaches, however, that the severity of the superego that a child develops by no means reproduces the severity of treatment it has itself experienced. It appears independent of it. With very mild upbringing, a child can acquire a very strict conscience. Yet it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to convince oneself that strictness of upbringing also has a strong influence on the formation of the child's superego. It comes down to this, that in the formation of the superego and emergence of conscience, innate constitutional factors and influences of the real environment cooperate. And this is by no means strange, but rather the general etiological condition of all such processes. One can also say, when the child reacts to the first great drive frustrations with excessively strong aggression and corresponding severity of the superego, it is thereby following a phylogenetic model and going beyond the actually justified response. For the father of prehistoric times was certainly terrible, and one could attribute to him the extreme measure of aggression. The differences between the two conceptions of the genesis of conscience thus